Hey, Brians, before we start, friend of the show and also friend, Rochelle Kopp, is doing something important we wanted to share with you. Work has started in Yoyogi Park on a project to build a public viewing site for the 2020 Olympics. Remember them? Which would have been upsetting enough simply because they're doing a lot of damage to one of the best things about Tokyo, beautiful drinking spots. But it's even worse because due to the pandemic, all the things they're building are totally pointless, even if the Olympics goes forward.
Which it won't.
There won't be any public gatherings that would require this space, or at least they shouldn't be. So Rochelle has started a multilingual petition calling to stop the work in progress and abandon the presumably lucrative For Someone project, which we wanted to let you know about. There's a link in the show notes and on our Twitter. If you haven't done so yet, please add your name to the petition and send Rochelle a thank you message, because honestly, as much as we like to take the piss on this show, we do love and care about Japan and the people who live there. And sometimes it's important to set aside our commitment to making a show full of dumb jokes and act with integrity in the face of brazen idiocy. So with that, Bobby, if you would.
Japan by River Cruise is made possible thanks to those who donate to the show at japanbyrivercruise.com and due to the generosity of our corporate sponsors. Today's platinum level sponsor is it's Densa with a message about the Yoyogi Tokyo Olympic Live site.
Fucking hell.
Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
And I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Dr. Thomas Baudinette, author of the forthcoming book, Regimes of Desire, Young Gay Men, Media, and Masculinity in Tokyo, and the only lecturer at Macquarie University to have been accused of taking unfair advantage of his faculty pass on the Lane Cove River lunch buffet cruise. Thomas, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
On this week's show, we'll talk to Tom about how male homosexuality is portrayed in the Japanese media and how that affects the acceptance or lack of acceptance of different kinds of gay identities, even in Japan's most famous gay town. And this week, we've got our first ever JBRC drinking game. If you'd like to play, just take a drink every time Ollie or I bend over backwards in an unnecessary attempt to prove that we're comfortable with our own sexuality.
Whoever bends over most is bottom.
Drink. Plus, Ollie's got your weekly River Cruise recommendation. Ollie?
Yes, Bobby. This week, I'll be recommending River Cruises, where you can enjoy a live show from one of the river safety awareness burlesque troupes in Osaka.
Plus, spring and early summer brings a variety of pride celebrations all over the world, and Japan is no different. We'll try to predict which of the Pride Regatta riverboats will make an LDP politician tweet something bigoted. But first, soap talk. Brian
here.
What is going on with you?
Thanks, Brian. Dr. Thomas, we enjoyed your tweet earlier in the month where you tweeted the problem of cool Japan meme, which was basically, how do you pronounce it? Weebo?
Weeaboo.
Okay. Where basically you were... in my view, potentially creating career sabotage, because I imagine 80% of the people who sign up for undergraduate Japanese courses at least start like this. People who, come what may, think that Japan has done no wrong.
I will also add myself to that list, actually, sadly. Though I repent now, knowing better and having learned a lot more from many of my fantastic teachers. But yes, it was... You know, I did get some heat, actually, from some people on Twitter who weren't happy about me kind of taking the piss of the weeaboo, but I do it with love.
Well, I mean, first things first, you tweeted it out with, I hope the students don't hate me forever for teaching and problematizing weeaboos. And you tweeted this little graphic with the problem of cool Japan with a super otaku-looking... Is this a caricature of Debito? It's very Arudo Debito looking.
I think that it was actually a parody of a character from Adventure Time because it had that kind of cat.
It
hat.
does. It looks like
Yeah,
Finn
it
too.
Does. But no, I'm not. I don't think that it was a Debito pun. But no, my students actually were much more receptive than I expected them to be. Some were a little bit kind of like, oh, I don't know, Sensei. I've always thought that it's kind of cool to be. I've always wanted to be like a Japanese person, or I've always wanted to have a Japanese girlfriend. The two kind of classic weeaboo tics. And I said to them, it's okay to like Japan, but I want you to realize that the Cool Japan initiative and the spread of Japanese popular culture has also kind of managed to sneak in some really problematic representations of the world. And what I want you to do is just be a little bit reflexive about when you're kind of at your next anime convention and think, maybe there's another Japan out there that is a bit divorced from Naruto.
This reminds me of a YouTube video I did forever ago where I mentioned being married to a Japanese woman, and I got a comment on the video that said, oh, that's so great that your wife is Japanese. My future wife is Japanese too. And I was like, oh, congratulations. When are you getting married? And they were like, no, haven't met yet. I just know that I'm going to pick a Japanese one.
I often get asked if my partner is Japanese, and I would first of all say I'm sadly single, but then I think it's really weird, and my students always assume, oh, is your partner Japanese, Sensei? And I'm like, after having studied Japanese gay men for 7 years, the firm answer is no way in hell. So
Really?
Has it actually put you off?
It did put me off, and not so much the people, but the kind of culture that they've come from, the spaces. I spent every night in Nichome for a very, very long time, and I can tell you that puts you off Japanese gay kind of culture very quickly. I can tell you now.
So let's just kind of try to be clear. Are you saying people raised in the Japanese culture with the Japanese mindset, or people of Japanese ancestry?
I mean,
because I know like there's a huge thing on Grindr where people will write like no Asians, and it's super problematic.
If I'm being honest, if I met the right person in Japan, of course I would happily date them. But when I say this rather tongue-in-cheek to my students, what I'm trying to get them to think about is that just because I study or teach Japanese studies, it doesn't necessarily mean that I am only exclusively attracted to Japanese people. And I'm trying to problematize that sort of thinking, because I think that, I've lost count of the students who've said to me, oh, I'm studying Japanese because I want a Japanese girlfriend. And I'm like, that's great, but what about other reasons? This kind of fetishization of Japan for Japan's sake has always been something that I've been concerned by.
It does seem like a very odd way to find a wife, though. To enroll in an undergraduate course.
I mean, they've never said they want a wife; they just want a girlfriend. Look, they're looking to learn the language in order to kind of meet their ideal, partner, which I think is great, and more power to them. But it is, a bit of a weird choice, and most of my students aren't doing it. It's just one or two, and. Look, I'm thinking also it's this idea that they're not necessarily looking for a wife, they're looking for a waifu, right? The kind of fetishized kind of anime girlfriend.
Submissive Japanese.
Yeah.
Will take care of you, wife. So you've already kind of broached this idea of gay culture in Japan and some of the negative things that you experienced with it, which I think is a big subject in your book and something that we want to get into in the news. But before we jump into that, we have some people to thank for coffees this week.
Yes, we need to thank Claire. Thank you very much, Claire, for buying your gateway coffee. One single coffee. We hope the next time you interact with our Buy Me a Coffee page, we also give you some stickers, just like Ryan did. Ryan bought one of the boys' package where he bought all of them. Every single bit of merch we have. So thank you very much, Ryan, who said, I didn't realize I needed this podcast so much.
We did. We did. We've been sitting here going, when is Ryan gonna realize? Ryan's last name starts with a B, by the way, which makes him B. Ryan.
There we go.
He's one letter off.
One of the boys and one of the Brians. Thank you very much. If you'd like to join Claire and Ryan in supporting the show and getting some juicy merch sent to you, then you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Japan by River Cruise. Bobby Judo, let's take a look at the news. Bobby Judo, what's in the news this week?
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Yes, it is not technically Pride Week in Japan anymore, but honestly, we've been following you on Twitter for a while now, Tom, and really interested in your new book, and we were looking for any excuse to have you on. And Pride seems like a great excuse.
Pride's always a great excuse to, celebrate and be proud, of course.
So you've got this new book on the way out. You can pre-order it now. It's called Regimes of Desire. Young gay men, media, and masculinity in Tokyo. And you've dedicated a lot of time to studying this, doing a lot of field interviews on this. First things first, I wanted to ask, what did you set out to look at with your book and why?
That's actually a really interesting question, because what I set out to look at when I began the project and what the book became are radically different.
It sounds really basic and dumb,
but
it's actually a really interesting question.
Yep. So I went to Japan during my PhD fieldwork because I really wanted to understand how young gay men, so men in their 20s living in Tokyo, would use media that has been produced for and by a gay male audience in order to make sense of their positioning in the world and to kind of deal with or make sense of the extremely patriarchal and heteronormative society that is contemporary Japan, as well as to respond to the fact that Japanese mainstream media doesn't have the most positive representation of same-sex desiring people, even though we've seen some changes in that recently. So that's what I set out to do. And I went into Nichome, Shinjuku Nichome, which I knew from both personal experience back during my wayward youth and from my scholarly research, was the place where young people, gay men, would gather in Tokyo looking for a good time and looking for a community to support themselves. I knew that it was the kind of most prominent gay town in Japan. They call it a gay no machi, filled with gay bars. One of my colleagues has estimated there's almost 400 gay bars in Nichome alone. And I went in with this naive expectation that I was going to learn about how fantastic Nichome was and what a emancipatory space it was. And on the surface, that was the first narrative that I uncovered when I started interviewing men in bars and started talking to people in the streets and kind of learning about how the space functioned. But as I spent more time interacting with people and developed kind of rapport with a particular group of young men who eventually emerged as my principal informants. And I built my whole book around the experiences of 4 specific individuals, actually. And what I started to learn was that behind Nichome, there was a bit of a dark side, and that the space wasn't as emancipatory or wasn't as nice even as what I had been initially led to believe.
You said that your book focuses on kind of a contemporary Japan with all of its problems of misogyny and patriarchy. Is that to suggest that gay men form a subset of the patriarchy, or are complicit, or are affected by it?
Well, I mean, so my argument is that Japan's heteronormativity, so the privileging of the compulsory nature of heterosexuality and its structuring into everyday life, and its privileging of patriarchal kind of structures, the family, the kind of focus on the father and the father figure as representative of the kind of nation state itself, obviously affects gay men, because gay men fail to live up to the ideas of what it means to be a good man in Japan, the hegemonic man in Japan. So there's this idea. One of the regimes of desire that my book explores is this hegemonic idea, what Japanese gay activist and scholar Fushimi Noriaki calls the hetero system, so the hetero system.
I understand that word.
Which is a system of sexual duality that assumes that there are two static genders, male and female, and that they have a specific static relationship in which the male actively desires the female and the female is passively desired by the male, and that these are matched onto the body, and that desire operates through this very gender binary term. In Japan, gay men have traditionally been assumed or understood as being women trapped in men's bodies because they are men who desire other men, and it doesn't necessarily work within this hetero system, this very rigid understanding of kind of the heteropatriarchal nature of Japanese society. So one of my informants would say that gay men in Japan are failed men, otoko shikaku, quoting the famous book Ningen Shikaku by Osamu Dazai in that quote, saying that gay men fail to live up to these ideals, and that is how they're disadvantaged by patriarchy. That is how they're disadvantaged by heteronormativity.
I see.
So in terms of gay representation in the media, I've always kind of thought and talked about in other places that the overwhelming majority of male homosexuality portrayed in the media is exactly as you just described, you know, a woman trapped in a man's body. It's oneke, it's okama, and there's this conflation between between being transgender and being gay. And like you said, the traditional understanding is a woman trapped in a man's body. But if there's this idea that that's the prevalent media representation, then does that mean that the most popular or kind of the predominant performance of gayness in Japan and its gay culture is femininity?
So the exact opposite is true. So what we have is that within Japan's gay subculture media, in response to that kind of positioning, this almost transgendered positioning of same-sex desiring men, the idea that they're women trapped in male bodies. Japan's gay media has a long history since the post-war period, so the 50s right up until the present day, of reacting against that stereotype and pushing forward a narrative of hypermasculinity. So we can see this emerging, as I said, in the 50s, but it continues right up until the present day, that most Japanese gay male media pushes a narrative of desirability is inherently built around hyper-masculine, hyper-rough, hegemonic forms of masculinity. So in other words, in order to fight back against the media's portrayal of same-sex desiring men through this kind of feminized or transgendered lens, they appropriate the stereotypes of masculinity that exist within society and then ramp them up a notch and then sell that to gay consumers as this is your emancipatory ideal. And whilst superficially that sounds like a very emancipatory and good thing, what my book identifies is that that's also causing all sorts of damage to young men.
Right, because you'll never get strong enough. You'll never get masculine.
Well, I mean, I'm not. I mean, obviously, everyone listening isn't going to be looking at me, but I have no hope in hell to have, like, you know, washboard abs and like a massive chest, because I'm much too pudgy. I'm an academic. I sit in front of a computer all day. I don't have the time or the energy. But you know, it's also the idea that what if your desire doesn't conform to that? So what really motivated my work was meeting young gay men who had come to Nichome to find a space of support and escape because mainstream society didn't give them a representation that helped them, and then finding that the representations in gay media and the way that Shinjuku Nichome promoted certain kinds of desires as normative also didn't help them because they weren't able to align themselves with those desires, nor did they want to. And then they lost their agency, and then they became confused.
It reminds me of this idea of kind of like being so woke that you go back around to being not woke. This idea that, in reaction to being expected to be feminine, they have to perform this ultra toxic masculinity could lead to a situation where they're like, dude, I'm the gayest here. I banged so many women last week.
It's what was really fascinating to me. Was the way in which I would interview, as I said, young gay men, and I was doing field work just to provide some historical context from 2012 to 2017. That was the period of time that I was traveling to Nichome back and forth, including a long stretch of field work in 2013 that was the majority of my data. And what was kind of said to me at one point in time by a few people was that Nichome was the site in Japan where real masculinity could be found. And they actually would say these fantastic kind of metaphor of Japan being, they used to say it was cursed by the beautiful boy, Bishonen no Noroi. And they were talking about the fact that Japanese society was losing out on some of its kind of traditional manliness, and that gay culture was kind of recuperating that in some way, shape or form. So I've always been, as a critical gender theorist and a queer theorist, so a radical queer theorist.
So what does that last one mean?
Radical queer theorist? Radical queer theory is the idea of challenging norms. So the idea that through our scholarship and our politics, we look at what is considered common sense and reveal the inherent problem within it.
That's what comedians do. I can get on board with this.
Making jokes is a radical queer act. It is 100% a radical queer act.
We're a radical queer podcast. Yes. I love it.
Exactly right. So
we should amend that and say we are a mediocre radical queer podcast.
So what I mean is that I'm concerned by anything that leads to the creation of norms. And that's why in my book I use the metaphor of a regime, because a regime is a system of control, right? And what I was really increasingly concerned by as I saw what I would call real psychological damage being caused to people that I was interviewing who they were being sold this fantasy of, washboard abs and mainstream stereotypical masculinity as a kind of cure-all for the fact that society discriminates against same-sex desiring people, but then being unable to align with that. The fantasy fell apart. It was causing harm.
I'd be annoyed. If I was told the answer to all my problems is I just have to go to the gym forever, and I go to the gym forever, then I've still got the problems, I'd be livid.
And it's also, as I said, the idea that it became to the state, in my book I argue that in Japan's gay media landscape, so I've looked at pornography, I've looked at dating sites, I've looked at advertising in Nichome. What else have I looked at? Manga, comics, magazines, all sorts of media that makes this rich tapestry, but everything is all about pushing hegemonic, normative ideas of masculinity. And it's all about norms. It's about aligning with norms. And the reason why that's concerning is because human desire and human experience is inherently messy. So trying to compartmentalize that into one particular narrative is great for the people who align with that narrative. But then the people who align with that narrative have all sorts of power within the system. And this leads to, people who are the hot shits in the bars get all the guys and then everyone else doesn't. And as I said, that causes psychic damage to people. I had informants, one of my informants in particular, he went through some really tough times. And if you're interested to learn more, you can buy my book and read about his very sad, tragic life. But he had some...
That's the worst plug ever. You sounded so happy saying it.
Because unfortunately my book isn't necessarily a happy one, because it's this idea that when I went to this space that was supposedly emancipatory, and then I found out for many people, many people, it wasn't emancipatory, then that kind of unlocked a real desire in me to write about the politics of desire, because I want there to be spaces in Japan where people who are disenfranchised can come together and support each other equally with tolerance and respect. And unfortunately, you know, if you go and party in Nichome every now and then, you won't see it. But if you're really kind of immersing yourself in it like I did, then you see some. I mean, this isn't just about masculinity. I also write about and saw instances of xenophobia and racism as well that was quite concerning.
Something that I've not quite understood about Japan is where the homophobia comes from, or rather which narrative it's viewed through. Because certainly in the UK, there's been a huge gay acceptance movement, and now the fact that gay marriage was legalized, the fact that generally speaking, the vast majority of the population don't harbor homophobic sentiment, nevertheless is up against some very, very strong sentiment. But that tends to come now with a certain religious bent. And I don't know much about America, but I think that's probably kind of true too. I think
I'd say religious.
If someone's out and out going, whereas Japan, one of the things that I quite like about Japan is that there isn't religion shaping societal norms in the same way that happens in the West.
Yeah, no, I want to correct that. I changed my mind. I think that the majority of homophobia in the U.S. comes from really wanting to suck a dick. I think that's probably
also true. But in Japan, perhaps, I mean, I just don't know, but perhaps the homophobia must come from somewhere else. If it's not religion, where does it come from?
The answer is because of the West.
Oh!
Yeah. Once again, the Europeans have dirtied things with their mucky little fingers. So, yeah, it comes from the history of Japan's modernization in the 19th century, the importation of Western medical science and Western understandings of sex, Papa Freud being translated into Japanese and introducing his model of psychosexual development. All of that has led to heteronormativity, erasing Japan's long history of queerness.
So we've been the problem. Could we also potentially be the solution? Could the pro-LGBT movements from the West be well translated into Japanese culture?
I mean, that's been happening for several centuries already. So
centuries?
Yeah. I mean, when the Christians down in Nagasaki were writing their anti kind of homoerotic polemics, the Japanese were writing back saying, "No, you're the weird ones." There was a long tradition of that. Japan advocates for itself, and there's been a long history of activism on behalf of sexual minorities that has predated the kind of gay and lesbian rights movement of the United States, for instance. And yes, of course, now in a globalizing world, everyone's kind of connected, but I think that the Japanese are doing, and the Japanese activists are doing a fairly good job of pushing back themselves, if that makes sense.
So how can we still take credit for it?
I mean, you colonize, which is what we're all very good at doing. I say as the Australian living on stolen land. Yeah. I think, I mean, there's a lot of solidarities being built, and I think that that's really important and crucial. But one of the things that I do get a bit frustrated by sometimes is seeing kind of expat LGBTQ people in kind of Japan trying to kind of fix Japan, quote unquote. Japan can deal with its own problems competently itself. Doesn't need to have a white savior come in on their white horse to save the place.
I don't know, hot guy on a white horse is not a bad start to a porno.
Drink.
Hey, thanks very much for listening to this episode 85 of Japan by River Cruise. If you've enjoyed the show, then we have a mailing list. You can sign up at japanbyrivercruise.com, and every month we spam you with some bonus bits.
Thank you to our guest this week, Tom Baudinette. This is going to be another one of those weeks where the extras alone will be worth signing up for a membership. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And if any of you, if Brian is interested in my book, it is available for pre-order from the University of Michigan Press. It will be out in October, where you can hear about more of what I've been talking about today.
Thank you very much, and we will see you next week.